Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the forum at St. Bart's in Midtown Manhattan. My name is Peter Thompson. I serve as the vicar here, and it's my joy and delight to welcome you. We're small and mighty here in the room, but I know there's a whole crowd on this rainy day watching online, and we're so glad that you're with us. We're also glad to have with us Kathryn O'Neal-Dunham. She is the CEO of Philanthropy New York, which is an association of 300 or so philanthropic organizations in New York City, and she's here to talk about how philanthropy works and how through their power they enact love in the world. We're really honored to have you here.
Thanks, Peter. Thank you all. Can everybody hear me okay? All good? Okay, great. For those online and for those with any visual difficulties, I'll do a quick description of myself. I am a white woman in my mid-40s with very short cropped hair. I'm wearing a navy dress today with a red necklace, and I'm delighted to be here with you all today, so thank you for inviting me. As Peter said, my name is Kathryn O'Neal-Dunham, and I am the CEO of Philanthropy New York. Philanthropy New York, like this church, is a membership association. So we have a group of institutional philanthropists in New York City, 280 to 300 at any given moment. And they are as small as tiny family foundations that have maybe one person who's running the philanthropy, and as large as some of the biggest institutions that you have heard about in the United States, like the Ford Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Carnegie Corporation of New York. And what they all have in common is that they are organized as corporations to give away funds each year. And so that is institutional philanthropy. And what I want to talk to you about today is all of the different forms of philanthropy. And then we'll get into some of the interesting stories around institutional philanthropy in the United States, which is a relatively new invention in our country. So if we could start really quickly by the folks online maybe can chat this in, the folks in the room. If you can just tell me one word that comes to mind when you think of philanthropy. One word. Giving. Generosity. Money. Any online? Did we have any chat in? Not yet. Okay. All right, great. Well, Peter alluded to it when he just introduced me. The word philanthropy, its Greek roots, are the love of humanity. The love of humanity. So when we talk about institutional philanthropy, we're getting much further away from the actual root word, love of philanthropy. And so tell me really quickly, what are some of the ways that you show your love for humanity? Volunteering. Giving. Say again? Kindness. Oh, kindness. Thank you. Kindness. Masks are difficult.
Sharing the scripture.
Sharing the scripture. Sharing the scripture. So you're naming some of the many ways that philanthropy has actually existed throughout time, right? It has not always been a highly professionalized pursuit. Philanthropy is the volunteering that we do every day. It is the volunteering that people in this church do for this church. It is the giving to your church, the giving to your local animal shelter, the giving to the homeless meal program. It is giving circles, where people pool the money that they have in order to, as a group, determine how they can then give back or identify areas that they would like to support. So it is a giving of yourself, of your time, of your money. It is supporting possibly, local advocacy for those who have less privilege than you do. It does not necessarily always mean writing a check from a donor-advised fund or giving a grant. It can mean much bigger things, and that is the core of what I like to think about when I talk to folks about what philanthropy is. And it's really important to understand that across the United States, institutional philanthropy, the philanthropy we talked about in the very beginning that are our members, is only a small fraction of the total amount that is given to help charities do the work that they do across the United States. Does anybody want to take a guess at the total amount of private funding by individuals in the United States that goes to nonprofits, or the total percentage of nonprofit giving that is done by individuals versus institutions?
500 million.
Gosh, I hope not. We'd have a very poor nonprofit infrastructure at 500 million. So when we look at, there's an organization called Giving USA that every year conducts a survey of annual giving to charities across the United States. The last number I have is from 2019, and this number changed dramatically in 2020, as you can well imagine. But the last institutional number from the years before the pandemic were that giving by individuals totaled an estimated $309.66 billion with a B, or 70% of total giving in the US. Foundations totaled $75.69 billion. That's only 17% of the total giving in the US. So when we talk about philanthropy as a love of humanity, it's clear that we have rich in this country of philanthropy going well beyond. And I think I'm
I think it's just skipping.
do I just need to, okay. I don't want anybody to miss this. It goes well beyond institutional philanthropy that we often think of as philanthropy. And it is worth remembering that and keeping that in mind when we talk about what traditions are around philanthropy, deeply rooted in individual giving. And that continues to be the case today. Philanthropy, even institutional philanthropy, is very much driven by our values. Many of you may give to the church, you may give to other things. What are some of the values that drive your giving? And for those of you online, if you want to chat something into the chat, please do. What are the values that drive your individual giving? Sorry, I had education and a feeling that the organization is able to leverage your money and use your dollars very well. Efficiency, if you will. The overall goal and your passion for the overall goal. Your personal feeling that that is an important thing for us to have in the country. A belief in the mission and the ways that that mission propels or supports a particular issue that human beings are having.
Yeah, to serve others,
Yeah, to serve others. Others? Yes. That's beautiful. So one of the values that really drives your philanthropy is both your personal lived experience and your belief that children in particular and adults who are hungry deserve to be fed. So a basic human right that you believe in. So those are critical to determining how we spend our resources and how we think about the ways that we contribute to and enrich our love for humanity. And that's very much the case across the board in how you see philanthropy in the United States. Philanthropy is very different in the United States than it is in other countries. As you can imagine, there are other countries who have socialist systems that pay more for health care. There are systems that ensure a living wage and that ensure that every person is housed, for instance. And so you have countries where philanthropy is a very new idea, much newer and much younger than in the American context, because you have countries where the government is seen as the primary driver of ensuring that everyone is fed, or that everyone is educated, that everyone is housed, everyone has health care. And so in Australia, for example, philanthropy has really only been an institution that has been growing in the past 20 years or so, because the country itself has tended to take care of its people. Really funny side story, I worked for a philanthropic foundation that had its roots in Australia, and there were no programs really for mothers and babies, which had been something that earlier in my career had been a very big part of my early career work, was around young people in foster care who had babies. And so that early mother-baby, mother-child bonding and health and stability was very important to me. And I couldn't quite figure out why none of the charities that we supported in Australia had any of that kind of context. And one of my Australian colleagues said to me, well, that's because the Australian government gives mothers money when they have new babies. They get $3,000 or $4,000 when they have a new baby in Australia, and they are able to set up everything they need. And if they can't breastfeed, they'll have the money for formula, and they have money for diapers and for a crib and all of that, because the Australian government gives them money when the baby is born. So there's far less need of the kind we have here. So that's just one of the ways that philanthropy is very different internationally. And we'll get into that a little bit more, but I would love to talk about the history that has created the philanthropy that we have today, or the institutional philanthropy that we have today here in the United States. Is there anything, when you think about how philanthropy in the United States got started, that comes immediately to mind? Eleanor Roosevelt.
Rockefeller, Carnegie.
The Rockefellers and the Carnegies, yes. I want to start there because Eleanor Roosevelt came a little bit later and was part of a long tradition of philanthropy in the US, but we are, as an Episcopal church, and I say we because I am also a member of the Episcopal church, we as early Protestants in the United States gave a lot of shape and form to how philanthropy came about. And the Rockefellers and the Carnegies were early Protestants. You know, when we think about the US context overall, I have a 13-year-old who's in 7th grade right now, and 7th grade is the study of US history from the start of the colonization of this country. And we are talking right now, we're studying for his finals, and so we are going on the entire survey from Jamestown all the way forward. And when we talked about the founding of Jamestown, he said they were sent, you know, these 104 men and boys, all men and boys, were sent to Virginia by the Virginia Company. The Virginia Company was a capitalist company that was sending people over to colonize, to take land and build something in order to get a return on their investment. And so the modern founding of our country and many of the folks who built wealth in this country built it off of stolen land, they built it off of stolen labor, and they often built it off of stolen wages. And the Rockefellers and the Carnegies, sadly, there are two really great podcasts that I would love to recommend to you all. One is Throughline, which is an NPR podcast, and they recently talked a little bit about the Rockefellers and John D. Rockefeller Sr., who owned a mine in Colorado, the Ludlow mine. And the 10,000 workers at the Ludlow mine went on strike because of really severely dangerous working conditions and underpayment. And when they went on strike, unfortunately, John D. Rockefeller was able to get the Colorado governor to call in the troops, and they killed about 30 of the miners and their wives and children during a strike break. So we have these stories of the Rockefellers also cured hookworm disease. We don't have hookworm in this country because the Rockefeller Foundation helped cure hookworm, as well as many other really severe diseases that killed us. So you have extraordinary gifts that led to the saving of thousands of lives. At the same time, you have the Rockefellers responsible for killing miners and their children and their wives. You have Andrew Carnegie, who probably had one of the most influential imprints on philanthropy in the United States. Has anyone heard of the Gospel of Wealth? The Gospel of Wealth was Andrew Carnegie's treatise on philanthropy. And what he said in the Cliff Notes version, or I understand now the kids read Spark Notes, no more Cliff Notes, Spark Notes. What Andrew Carnegie said in the Gospel of Wealth is, I must be endowed with a kind of intelligence that is much higher than that of my average worker. And I should not pay my average worker too much because they will spend it on liquor and booze and women. And instead, I should constrict their wages, and I should amass that wealth myself. And then because I am so intelligent as to be able to make this wealth, I should be the one who gives it away, and I should decide how it should be given away. And that gospel of wealth has very much characterized the way that institutional philanthropy was built out in the United States. Now, Andrew Carnegie is responsible for the entire US library system. Were it not for his gifts, we would not have the New York Public Library sitting out there with its beautiful lions, and we would not have a number of US libraries throughout our system because he essentially set up challenge grants for localities and said, I will help you build a library if you will also put in state money and city money. And that is how we have a modern public library system in the United States. But at the same time, Andrew Carnegie's workers, about 25% of his workers died from work-related conditions. About 3,000 people became sick or died in Andrew Carnegie's industrial revolution. So we have these incredible competing ideas about humanity and how we show our love for humanity in the early forming of institutional philanthropy in the United States. And it is almost as if there is a segregation of our capitalist ideas from our ideas around giving. That shows up a lot today. We don't often think about some of the ways that our institutional philanthropy operates that is so very different from the intent and the impact of our institutional philanthropy can be very different. There are enormous advances that I do not want to undercut, and this is, my membership is institutional philanthropy, and so I hold a vision for this work that I believe can be closer to our love of humanity. I believe that we can bring ourselves back to a closer alignment with love for humanity. But it is worth noting the history that got us here, because that is often what shapes the decisions that we make day after day without even questioning what the impact of those decisions might be. Before I go into some of the big questions, I want to get a quick time check from Peter. 10:22. Okay, great. I want to give you guys some of the big questions that we are grappling with in institutional philanthropy today. But before I go into that, I wanted to just spend a few minutes, because I've just told you some really deep, dark history. I wanted to spend a few minutes talking about some of the big advances that philanthropy has pushed forward. Does anybody, other than the curing of hookworm and the establishment of the library system, does anyone else know some of the big advances that philanthropy has been responsible for in the United States or abroad? Vaccines around the world, absolutely. Medical advances, huge medical advances. Any others?
Scholarships, making education more.
Yeah, scholarships and research, some of the great research in our institutions. Support for our art systems. So does anybody know the story of the founding of MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art? Has anyone seen The Gilded Age on HBO? So when the ladies come together and they say this new money is going to build another whole opera? It's based off of the idea that Abby Rockefeller had begun collecting a lot of modern artists, Chagall, Matisse, Picasso, and when she went to the Metropolitan Museum of Art and said, "I'd like to donate these pieces," they said, "Oh, we don't take that art. That's not our idea of what art is." And so Abby Rockefeller gathered a couple of friends, bless you, in the parlor of John D. Rockefeller Sr.'s house, and they said, "We're going to build a modern art museum to house all of this modern art of these artists that no one believes in." So yes, our art system, many of our great advances in art, theater, dance, etc., all from philanthropy. The fight for gay marriage in this country. The fight for gay marriage in this country was funded by a network of foundations who recognized that we might not be able to get a federal push and that we would have to go state by state until we built up such capacity within the states for passing legislation that the issue would have to come to the Supreme Court. And that was probably a 20-year commitment to human rights and to building the path to gay marriage, funded primarily by philanthropy. So there have been some amazing medical advances, wonderful arts that we would not otherwise get to appreciate and see, and basic human rights that we sometimes take for granted in law right now, all funded by philanthropy. So there is real power to bring, as I said, alignment with institutional philanthropy and our love of humanity. It's real meaning. Right now, the sector, the professional institutional philanthropy sector, is grappling with some big questions, and I would submit to you that many of them are rooted in those values we talked about earlier, how our values show up in this work, and in that history that we talked about earlier, and how that shows up in this work. One of the big things that we talk about right now in institutional philanthropy is the ways that in our efforts to professionalize the field and in making the field more strategic and thinking deeply about how this money gets spent so that we're not just writing checks and sending it off, but really trying to think about what are the changes like medical advances and human rights advances that we want to make. In doing so, we've created a system of hoops for people to jump through. We've created grants management systems and reporting requirements and application requirements that have actually taken us away from the deep relationship that we need to be in when we are giving money, right? When we talked earlier about what drives you, you were all talking about what is my personal lived experience and the thing that I know will make a real difference. And that is at the heart of philanthropy, right? We're really looking for what is it that we can do that will help make this difference for people. But we have created, in our McKinsey-esque ways, created whole systems that don't necessarily serve that deeper relationship and that ability to trust a grantee and say, I'm going to give you this money and know that you're going to have the expertise you need to carry this out and do this work well. There's a very big critique that I think is worth listening to deeply and figuring out how to adapt to, which is that philanthropy is undemocratic. The more we allow individuals to amass great wealth and put it into foundations and decide how to spend it, the more we are not taxing great wealth and putting that into the hands and the coffers of elected officials to decide how to spend it, then the more undemocratic we are becoming. Because what we are doing is allowing a few elite individuals who have amassed great wealth to make decisions about where we spend that money. So instead of the National Institutes of Health spending money on medical advances, we are allowing individuals to decide what money gets spent on medical advances. Instead of allowing the National Endowment for the Arts to decide based on a group of people who are elected and appointed, we are allowing individuals to decide which arts get funded. And so there is a real critique that goes to the heart of the tax system that created philanthropy to begin with, that is about understanding how we can go back to the initial idea, which is a love of humanity and not a shadow democracy or a shadow undemocratic system that is operating in philanthropy. And I think that's a really important one. There are some fabulous books written by folks who have done amazing research on this. Anand Giridharadas, Winners Take All. My friend Edgar Villanueva wrote Decolonizing Philanthropy, and I commend those books to you if you're interested in learning more about this idea. There's also a real conversation in philanthropy that I think is tied to all of this around perpetuity versus spending down. Most foundations are created to stand and live in perpetuity, well beyond their donor's death, well beyond there even being a family member from the donor still involved. They're created to outlive all of us. And there is a question about whether or not that should be the case. If we are not taxing people, if we are allowing a system to continually set up more and more and more of these philanthropies, and they are only required by law to spend down 5% of their endowment every single year, and that is the requirement, 5%. For those of you who are investing, as my husband is, you know that the more money you have, the more money your money makes. And if you have $13 or $14 billion sitting in an endowment, 5% is not a lot to give away. You can just keep growing and growing and growing. And so the question is, and the Attorney General, has laws for all of the trustees who sit on these foundation boards saying you must safeguard this money. The question is the idea to grow the money, or is the idea to put the money to the purpose that it was designed for in the beginning? And so there are many foundations who are exceeding that 5% payout. And there is a certain place where once you exceed that 5% payout, you start spending down your principal. And so then you have the question that the trustees must ask themselves: do we want to be existing in perpetuity, well beyond the life of any of us who sit as trustees around this table? Or do we want to spend this down now in our lifetime to make a difference right here and now? The vast majority of institutional foundations right now have decided that they want to be in perpetuity. That is what they tend towards. It is actually quite difficult to figure out how to spend down while you're still living. It's not undoable. So the Atlantic Philanthropies finally shut their doors last year. And that was $3 billion, I believe, that Jack Feeney gave away in his lifetime while he was living. Another big question, because we set these foundations up with legal instruments, is around donor intent. So many of these foundations are set up in a very open and vague way that gives anyone who comes after the donor a lot of latitude to be able to decide, how do you support women and children? How do you support the arts? And that gives the folks who are gathered around the table the ability to adapt to anything that comes down the pike, right? New artists emerge, new ways of performing emerge. You want to be able to be adaptive and be where the funding is most necessary. New laws are passed. We have, some kind of other support for women and children. How do we then adapt this money? And then there are those donors who very prescriptively say in their wills and their instruments, this is how the money must be spent. And does that make sense? And is that the way that trustees should continue 150 years later to be giving the money out? A lot changes in 150 years, as we can all imagine, as my 13-year-old would tell you with his 7th grade American history. Racial equity has been a deep, deep question that I know churches are asking themselves right now and donors are asking themselves right now. When we look at the history that I outlined, stolen land, stolen labor, we are talking about a history in the United States that has systemically and institutionally oppressed and marginalized people based on racialized identities. And if we want to do systemic work to rebuild and to repair and to create a new kind of society, foundations must be looking at the implications for themselves and their own histories and for their funding right now, for who's making the decisions, how the decisions are getting made, and how we're basically putting this money back in a way that repairs what has been done. And then I think ultimately one of the biggest questions that many foundations are grappling with right now is accountability. There's very little accountability, there's very little legal accountability in the foundation sphere. They must give the IRS a 990, which is like their tax return each year, and say, this is how we spent the money we spent. There is an attorney general, as I said earlier, in New York that oversees all charities and ensures that they are operating within certain boundaries of the law. But that's really it. So when we go back to that first question around is philanthropy democratic or undemocratic, we're talking about a sector that is largely unaccountable. There's no one that's elected or appointed. There is no one that they have to seek advice or input from. And so when you have institutions that are funding in a low-income community in the Bronx or in a small, town in Africa, who are they getting input from? Who are they listening to? Who is shaping their decision-making? And how can they be more accountable to the strategies and the goals and the people that they say they want to help? And so that accountability question is one of the largest questions that the sector is asking itself right now. So that's a big overview of philanthropy and the sort of history that has brought us to the present day and some of the big questions that institutional philanthropy is grappling with right now. I would love to hear if any of you have questions about institutional or individual philanthropy and questions about what we've talked about today that I could answer.
And if you're online to submit a question, please use the live chat function on YouTube or the comments function on Facebook. You can also email me, pthompson@stbarts.org. That's pthompson@stbarts.org. And if you're here in the room, we also have comment cards that you can use and turn into that basket right there. We actually already have some questions from our online audience. One person is wondering if you can talk about the 2 podcasts again that you recommend and share their titles and names again.
Yeah, absolutely. So NPR has a podcast called Throughline, THROUGHLINE, Throughline. Throughline's an interesting podcast because it takes almost any current day issue and will trace back the history and help you understand the through line of history to today. They did an episode probably a month or 2 ago on, I think it was called The Gilded Age, and it talks a lot about some of the history that I shared with all of you and some of the current day questions that we were talking about as well. The second podcast is by Vox, VOX, and it's called Future Perfect. Future Perfect has 5 or 6 seasons, and I think their first season was a 6-part series on philanthropy. And we talked about some of the more progressive changes that philanthropy has brought about. The Vox Future Perfect podcast goes into some of the very conservative ways that conservative philanthropy helped to build the modern judicial system that we have today, the modern Supreme Court that we are living with today. So there are some interesting episodes there about how conservative philanthropy has made inroads on a very, very politically conservative point of view.
Can you speak to donor-advised funds and their role in the philanthropic ecosystem?
I sure can, and there's some interesting legislation that's been proposed recently for donor-advised funds. Does anyone here have a donor-advised fund? They're very easy to set up. The New York Community Trust holds some of the biggest donor-advised funds in New York City. So a donor-advised fund is a vehicle that is a little bit simpler and easier to set up than a foundation. You don't have to incorporate, you don't have to have a board of trustees. A donor-advised fund allows you to put money aside that is not taxed into a fund so that you can spend it on charitable things in the future. So the difference between just making a donation today to St. Bart's, for instance, for your annual giving, the difference between making a donation today and taking the deduction in the year in which you make the donation, and making a donation to a donor-advised fund is that you can make the donation to the fund now, but you can pay out grants for years and years to come. It is not time limited. And in fact, if you establish a donor-advised fund at a place like the New York Community Trust, it can live well beyond you. And the New York Community Trust will have professional grant makers who will give in the ways that you want that money given well beyond your lifespan. The question that has come up and the legislation that has come up is that unlike private foundations who have a 5% payout on their endowment, donor-advised funds do not mandate a payout. So in New York City, every single day, someone sells a company and say they make $100 million. But they don't want to be taxed on all $100 million. So they put $20 million into a donor-advised fund, and then they pay taxes on the $80 million that is left. And that donor-advised fund now has $20 million that can be given out to charity at any time. But it could also sit there. It's money that just went into the public trust, money that was not taxed. And there is no demand that it be paid out. So there is legislation that has been introduced for mandating a lifespan on donor-advised funds and mandating ways that donor-advised funds need to be much more carefully watched, because once they're created, they are also invested, right? They're put into the stock market. They can grow and grow and grow. And that money is not taxed ever. And so there is a real push to say, are people giving money at good rates from their donor-advised funds? And should these exist in perpetuity? should they be able to be invested and grown, or should they be put to use in the way that, if something is not taxed, it's in the public trust, it should be put into the public good. So there is legislation called the ACE, Accelerating Charitable Efforts Act, that has been introduced in both the House and the Senate to tackle the donor advised fund question.
We have a lot of really interesting questions. I hope we'll have a chance to fit them all in. One person wonders if you can talk about the website Charity Navigator and other tools to evaluate recipients of donations.
Yeah, and there are a number of tools. I'm not as well versed as I could be in many of them. All of these tools are designed to help you make decisions, I think you said earlier, about effectiveness. Some of them have come up with ideas that I don't necessarily agree with, like there is a ratio that folks love to say that if people spend too much money on administration and fundraising and not enough money on program, they should be dinged and have lower numbers of stars and things like that. But the truth of the matter is, every business that runs puts money towards IT and HR and finance systems and all of the things that make that business run. And no one would ever say to a going business, to your local insurance salesperson, you shouldn't spend money on your computers, or you shouldn't spend money on your constituent relationship management software. No one would say to them, you shouldn't have an employment lawyer who looks over your employee handbook. And yet charities are consistently dinged for spending money on the very infrastructure that helps them to then literally save lives, right? During COVID, you had nonprofits who dropped everything and people who continued to come in every single day to make sure that the homeless had a place to be, that the developmentally disabled did not contract COVID and were able to do what they needed to do. So many of these websites are helpful tools for finding charities, finding out information about charities. I would say Candid, which has a database that allows you to look at the 990 of these organizations, is a really good tool. Looking at the 990 helps you understand who are their trustees, how much is their highest paid staff paid. It gives you an outline of all of the different ways that they spend their money in large buckets. And so there are tools like Candid that I think you can do some of your own due diligence around. I would just be wary of the kinds of ratios that pit administrative spending against program spending, because I think it's a bit of a false narrative.
Some philanthropists have different morals than others. If you're an organization deciding who to accept money from, how do you make such a decision?
Oh gosh, this is the Sackler question, right? This is the question that many museums are asking themselves right now, and many others. I don't think that there is anyone who has an answer to this question. I do believe firmly, and at Philanthropy New York, we have said, because we are a membership association for foundations, that having values and being clear about your own values and how the money you take in will be spent to further your values is incredibly important. I think that there are questions about whether or not folks are willing to be accountable for the ways that the money was made and the ways that the money is being used in the present, and that's a whole conversation about accountability. It is very hard for me to say to a charity ever, you should not take in money, because at the end of the day, the charity itself is doing the critical work using its own values as guides to how it does that work in the world. So it's extremely hard to say, don't take this money, but do take that money. We all live in a capitalist society. The evils of capitalism are woven into everything we do and everything we buy and everything we touch. So it is extremely hard to say to a charity not to accept the money. I think it's a very important conversation to have up front with donors and with foundations about values alignment.
One final question will fit in. How is the field of philanthropy doing when it comes to issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion? And how is the field working to become more diverse?
Yeah. So on the diversity question, what I would say is I can't speak to the whole entire field. What I can speak to are the 280, 300 members that Philanthropy New York works with. And institutionally, what I have seen in the last 8 years is a shift towards more diversity and representation in hiring. That has looked like many more people of color as program officers, some more people of color as the executive directors and CEOs of foundations. It has looked like a much more inclusive LGBTQ inclusive environment in foundations. But I think there is it is incredibly important to acknowledge the difference between diversity efforts and then what it means to build an actual inclusive culture in an organization, one that is not dominated by specific patriarchal, white, hetero norms. And then I think there is a whole other conversation that is about equity. And I would say in our membership, in the community that is Philanthropy New York, the equity conversation is one that has started, but is very nascent, because equity at its core requires examining power. Who holds it? Who shares it? How is it being utilized? Who's making decisions? Who are we listening to? And then how are we thinking about these norms and this inclusivity in a way that are we willing to break open and really truly change who we are and what principles we hold in doing work together and what a professional environment looks like, how we're spending the other 95%, right, that whole endowment. All of those questions are much deeper, longer journeys. It took 400 years for the United States to get where we are today and to do what we have done to build the systems that we are living in right now. The steps that we take now are the blueprint for imagining equity going forward. We could diversify all day long. We could have staffs that are entirely, diverse and represent every single kind of racialized and gender orientation, et cetera, across the board, and we could still be operating in ways that uphold the current system. So I think the sector is making very good strides in trying to build a more diverse representation, but I think equity is a much deeper, longer journey that we all need to be on.
Thank you so much, Kathryn. It's been great to have you with us today. Thank you for giving us a window into your field.
Thank you very much. It was so nice to be with you all.
We hope you'll stick around and join us for worship at 11 a.m. in just a few minutes. We also hope you'll be back for the forum next week. We'll be welcoming Professor Emily Blank of Rowan University, who's writing a book on Juneteenth to tell us about the history of Juneteenth and help us as we mark this new federal holiday. We will also have a special edition of the forum online only earlier this week on Tuesday at 7:30 p.m. We're going to be welcoming virtually Kathryn Meeks, who's the executive director of the Absalom Jones Center for Racial Healing. She's going to be in conversation with our own canon, Stephanie Spellers, about Juneteenth and its relationship to the church. So a very important week coming up. I hope you'll join us for both of those conversations. Take care.